The sun beat down on the town square of Red Hollow like judgment itself, hot and unflinching. Dust swirled around the boots of the gathered townsfolk, some there by curiosity, others by obligation, but none willing to speak aloud the wrong they were about to witness. In the center of it all, standing beside her father's worn cane and even more worn pride, was 17-year-old Lena May Calderon. Her dress was plain and patched, the color of old milk, and her hands clutched the hem as if to keep from shaking. Her eyes too wide, too young scanned the wooden faces of the town council lined up on the platform. Not one of them could meet her gaze. Sheriff Dunn shifted uncomfortably beside the judge, his mustache twitching as though it wanted to say something his mouth didn't dare. Behind Lena May, her father coughed hard, the sound wet and sharp, a reminder of the mineshaft collapse that had crushed his legs and half his spirit 7 years earlier. He leaned on his cane like it was the only thing holding him upright. In truth, it was Lena May who'd been holding everything together for years, the cooking, the cleaning, the prayers, the hope. But none of that could pay off the debt he owed. Harlan Pike stepped forward with slow, deliberate steps. He wore a black vest that glinted with gold buttons and a snakeskin belt too fine for a man with a heart so rotten. His beard was trimmed, his hair slicked back with oil that stank when the wind shifted. He removed his hat like a gentleman, but the smile he wore was all wolf. "I accept the bargain," he said, loud enough for the whole square to hear. "The girl will come to me by sundown tomorrow, and the debt shall be considered paid in full." Lena May's breath caught. A collective silence followed, broken only by a baby's cry in the distance. Her father didn't look at her not once. He stared at the ground like a man who'd sold his soul and didn't want to watch it walk away. She turned her face to Harlan Pike, trying to hold steady. "I'm not cattle," she said softly. No one responded. Pike's grin widened, slow and venomous. "Oh, I don't need cattle, sweetheart. I need company. I need someone obedient, someone who understands what's expected of her." He turned to the council. "And unless there are objections, I believe this meeting is adjourned." None came. The gavel struck wood, and with it, Lena May's life shifted into something she didn't recognize. The crowd began to thin. No one met her eyes. Not the blacksmith who'd once offered her fresh bread on Sundays. Not the preacher who'd baptized her in the river. Not even her best friend's mother, who used to braid her hair when her own mama was still alive. Lena May stood frozen in place, the heat pressing down like a stone. She wasn't a criminal, wasn't a sinner, and yet the whole town had just sentenced her to a life she hadn't chosen. And the man walking away with her future? He didn't want a wife. He wanted control. He wanted silence. He wanted to break something that hadn't been broken yet. And as the dust settled over Red Hollow, one thing became cruelly, terrifyingly clear. No one was coming to save her. The swinging doors of the Dusty Spur saloon creaked open and shut all afternoon as the news spread like wildfire down the main strip of Red Hollow. Inside, the air was thick with pipe smoke and the sour smell of cheap whiskey, punctuated by the occasional burst of forced laughter and the clatter of poker chips on old wood. Beneath it all ran something quieter, heavier, the tension of something ugly being passed around in lowered voices and sidelong glances. "She's just a child," muttered Cora from behind the bar, wiping a cloudy glass with the edge of her apron. Her voice was low but not low enough. "Ain't your business," replied one of the older ranch hands near the center table, staring into his drink like he wished he could disappear inside it. Cora slammed the glass on the counter harder than needed. "She was friends with my niece, used to sit on my porch and sew little dolls out of flour sacks. Now Harlan Pike's claiming her like he bought her at auction." A few heads turned, but no one said a word. The piano player coughed and stopped playing. The silence that followed was telling. In the corner, nearly swallowed by the shadows, a man sat with one boot crossed over the other, and a battered hat pulled low over his brow. His whiskey glass hadn't moved in over an hour, the amber liquid untouched save for the one slow sip he'd taken when he'd first walked in. His name was Rhett Maddox, though most folks in Red Hollow referred to him only in whispers, the devil of Dry Creek Ridge. No one really knew what Rhett did for a living, other than keep to himself up in the hills and show up in town once every few weeks for supplies and silence. Stories clung to him like burrs that he'd shot a man dead for looking at him wrong, that his ranch was haunted by the ghost of a woman who never left, that he buried his gold instead of trusting the bank. Folks didn't ask questions because they didn't want to be the next story. Tonight, as the talk circled tighter and tighter around Lena May Calderon, Rhett's eyes lifted just barely from the rim of his glass. He didn't speak, didn't blink. Just stared toward the mirror behind the bar, watching the reflection of each man who dared to say her name like she was already lost. "He's gonna break that girl," someone near the back said in a low tone. Harlan's always liked his women scared. A flicker, barely noticeable, passed through Rhett's expression. His jaw tensed. One gray eye narrowed a hair's breadth. "I heard he told the council he'd take her debt or her blood," another whispered. "Not like her daddy had a choice. Man can't even walk no more." The bartender dropped a bottle, and everyone jumped. Cora cursed under her breath, more rattled than the sound warranted. No one offered to help. Still in the corner, Rhett leaned back slowly in his chair, the legs creaking. He drained his whiskey in one long pull, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and set the glass down with a soft thunk. No one noticed he was listening. No one ever did. But as he stood to leave, coat brushing the floor, spurs jingling low and deliberate, a cold gust seemed to sweep through the saloon not from the door, but from the weight of something shifting in the room. He said nothing, just walked out. But for the first time that evening, the whispers stopped. The evening sun turned the sky to copper, burning slow and low as it dipped behind the hills beyond Red Hollow. Shadows stretched long across the churchyard, where half the town had gathered out of obligation, curiosity, or the sick pull of spectacle. Lena May Calderon stood at the top of the chapel steps in a white dress that looked like it had been salvaged from a rag bin. It clung to her bony frame with a kind of sad defiance, the frayed lace at the collar fluttering in the dry wind like a tattered flag. She didn't cry. Not now. She'd done all her crying in the night, when no one could hear her. Now there was nothing left but fear and the dull sense of falling into something she couldn't stop. Her father stood beside her, hunched over a small table dragged out from the church's front room. His hand trembled violently as he scrawled his name across the agreement drawn up by Harlan Pike's lawyer. The pen scratched across the paper like a blade on bone. When he finished, he didn't look at her, just backed away and leaned heavily on his cane, shame written deep in the folds of his weathered face. Harlan Pike stepped forward next. He wore a silver suit, polished boots, and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. His fingers were thick with rings, one of them shaped like a serpent eating its own tail. He tipped his hat toward Lena May, mock gallant. "You'll make a fine wife," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, one way or another. The preacher, an old man with too little courage and too much fear, cleared his throat and opened his Bible with shaky hands. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered. She ain't yours to take." The voice cut through the warm evening air like a whip crack. All heads turned. Rhett Maddox stood at the edge of the crowd, boots dusty from the trail, a long-barreled shotgun slung casually over one shoulder. He didn't raise it, didn't need to. The way he stood, the way his gaze landed like a weight on Harlan Pike's chest, was weapon enough. The murmurs stopped instantly. Harlan's smile faltered, only for a moment. "This is a private ceremony, Maddox. You weren't invited." Rhett stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. His spurs clinked softly with each step, steady as a funeral drum. "Didn't come for cake and dancing," he said. "Came because this ain't a wedding. This is a goddamn sale." The preacher shut his Bible. Lena May's breath caught. Her hands clenched into fists. And for the first time in days, she felt something hot surge through her chest that wasn't fear-hope, maybe, or something close to it. "You got no right to interfere," Harlan growled, stepping forward. "I've got every right," Rhett replied. unslinging his shotgun and letting it rest casually in both hands. Especially when the girl's being handed over like a sack of grain to a man who buys obedience instead of earning respect. The silence was electric. No one moved. Not the preacher. Not Lena May's father. Not even the sheriff. And in that moment, as the sun dipped behind the chapel and the last golden light lit Rhett's face like something biblical, the entire town of Red Hollow held its breath. Something had shifted, a line had been crossed, and the ceremony was over. The tension in the churchyard was so thick it might as well have been smoke. No one spoke, no one moved. Harlan Pike stood stiff as a gun barrel, his fists clenched at his sides, face a deepening red. Rhett Maddox hadn't blinked once since he walked through the crowd, the shotgun resting easy in his grip like it belonged there as natural to him as breathing. The townsfolk kept their distance, eyes bouncing between the two men like spectators at a hanging, unsure who'd be the one to fall. Then Rhett moved. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into the inside pocket of his weathered duster and pulled out a thick, folded piece of paper, worn soft from years of handling. He held it up for all to see, and when he spoke, his voice carried. "This here's a deed," he said, "to a silver claim in Elkhorn Gulch. Been mine for 6 years, worth at least 10 times the pittance Harlan's owed." The gasps came like a wave. Even the preacher leaned in, squinting at the paper as if it might burn him. Cora from the saloon muttered something under her breath, and old Tobias Vance let out a low whistle. Rhett's eyes never left Harlan. "I'll pay the debt in full. Right here, right now." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Even Lena May's father blinked in stunned disbelief. The weight of that claim could buy half the town. Most folks assumed Rhett was sitting on dust and old ghosts out on Dry Creek Ridge. No one thought he had anything like this. Harlan's voice came out tight. "And what do you want in return?" Rhett looked over at Lena May, still frozen in her threadbare white dress, her fists clenched like they were the only thing keeping her upright. Then, back at Pike. "Nothing, except this. The girl chooses her own fate. No one decides it for her. Not her father, not you, not me." A hush swept over the crowd, heavy and uncertain. It was the kind of thing no man in Red Hollow had ever said out loud, not about a woman, not about one so young and poor she barely existed in their ledgers. But Rhett said it like it was scripture, like anything less would be blasphemy. Harlan Pike's calm shattered. He stepped forward, seething. "You think you can embarrass me in front of this town? You think throwing money around makes you better than me? That girl was promised. You can't just waltz in here and rewrite the law." "I ain't rewriting the law," Rhett said coolly. "I'm fixing what never should have been written in the first place." The crowd tensed as Harlan's hand twitched near his hip, brushing the edge of his coat where a pistol might rest. Rhett shifted his weight ever so slightly, shotgun still cradled, but his eyes sharpened like broken flint. And then a voice broke through. "That's enough," came Sheriff Dunn, stepping forward with the careful authority of a man who knew one wrong word could spark gunfire. He stood between them, one hand near his holster, the other held up like a wall. "We're not spilling blood in front of the church. Not tonight." He turned to Lena May. "You come with me, child." She hesitated, eyes darting between the three men. Then slowly, like a sleepwalker, she descended the steps and followed the sheriff into the crowd. No one tried to stop her. Not even Harlan. Not now. But as she disappeared into the darkness beyond the square, every soul in Red Hollow knew this wasn't done. You could delay a fire, smother its smoke, but if the coals still glowed, it would burn again. And Harlan Pike wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. The wind that night rattled the shutters on the abandoned schoolhouse where Sheriff Dunn had taken Lena May for safekeeping. It was one of the few places left in Red Hollow that Pike didn't have eyes on. The building smelled like dust and dried ink, the blackboards still smudged with arithmetic from years ago. A cot had been dragged into the corner, along with a kerosene lamp and a blanket too thin for comfort. Lena May sat upright on the cot, still wearing the white dress that now felt like a ghost draped across her skin. Her hair hung loose around her shoulders, tangled and tired. Her hands stayed folded in her lap, knuckles tight, eyes sharper than they had any right to be after everything that had happened. She hadn't said much since the churchyard, not to the sheriff, not to the townsfolk whispering through the cracks of the saloon, and certainly not to Rhett Maddox. Until now. He stood by the doorway, back against the frame, arms crossed over his chest. His hat was off, hair mussed, jaw dark with stubble and tension. He'd been there for the better part of an hour, silent as stone, watching, waiting. "Why?" Lena May asked, voice low but steady. Rhett didn't move. "Why would a man like you do this for a girl like me?" she repeated, a bit louder now. "You could have ridden off. You could have let it happen. Everyone else did." Still, he said nothing. "I've heard the stories," she added, her eyes narrowing. "They say you ran with horse thieves out near Laramie, that you once shot a preacher in Amarillo. They say there was a woman deed on your land. Your wife, maybe, or someone else's." His jaw tightened, but his gaze didn't shift. "I don't need saving," she said. "Not from a man who looks at me like I'm already broken." That made him move. Slowly, he pushed off the doorframe and walked toward her. The lamp cast flickering shadows across his face, highlighting the rough edges, the scars time had left behind. When he spoke, his voice was rough and low, like gravel rolling downhill. "I know you didn't ask for saving," he said. "I didn't come to play hero." "Then what did you come for?" He sat down on the bench across from her, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. For a long moment, he stared at the floor. Then, like something heavy finally giving way, he spoke. "There was a girl," he said. "Years ago. Her name was Annie. She was 17, same as you. Worked at a boarding house where I holed up after a job went south." Lena May didn't speak, she just listened. She was sweet, brave, smarter than any man she ever served whiskey to. "One night, some men came looking for me. Bad men. She tried to lie for me, cover my trail. They figured her out. Took her instead." He looked up now, and his eyes were raw, even beneath the grit. "I found her 2 days later, in a ravine. What they did to her." His voice caught, then hardened. "I buried her myself. Never even knew her last name. But I swore then if I ever saw it coming again, if I ever saw that look in someone's eyes and had the chance to stop it, I wouldn't wait." Silence filled the room, heavy as a coffin. Lena May's hands loosened in her lap. Her voice, when it came, was softer. "And you saw it in me?" Rhett nodded. "Saw it the moment I heard your name." She turned her face away, the corner of her mouth trembling. "I'm not her." "I know," he said, "but you shouldn't have to end the same." And for the first time since this nightmare began, Lena May believed that maybe, just maybe, someone saw her as more than a burden or a bargain. She was still afraid, but she wasn't alone. The fire lit up the night like a second sun. It started with a low crackle of kindling catching dry wood, subtle, almost gentle, like a whisper you don't hear until it's too late. Rhett was the first to smell it. Smoke. Sharp, acrid, and wrong. He kicked the door open before Lena May even had time to sit up from her blanket near the hearth, the half-boiled coffee still on the stove. "Get your boots," he said, voice flat but urgent. She didn't ask why. The orange glow already pulsed through the cracks in the shutters. She threw on her shawl, heart pounding, and followed him out the back, barefoot in the dirt for just long enough to feel the cold sting of night on her soles. The barn was already gone, a roaring tower of flame clawing at the sky, sending embers drifting like fireflies across the ridge. The dry brush along the fence line had caught, and now the fire raced toward the cabin like it had a purpose, like it was angry. "They said it," Lena May whispered, her voice shaking. Rhett didn't answer. He just grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the hollow path behind the Smokehausen old trail, barely wide enough for 2 feet at a time. His shotgun was slung over his shoulder, but he didn't stop to use it. Whoever had done this was long gone. This wasn't meant to be a fight, it was a message. The flames reached the roof as they crested the ridge, both of them breathless from the climb. Sweat streaked across soot-covered skin. They stopped at the overlook, where Rhett's land stretched below, like a black canvas slashed by fire. The cabin hissed and cracked as it collapsed inward, the smoke rising into the stars like a prayer gone wrong. Lena May dropped to her knees in the dirt, coughing, arms wrapped around herself as the heat licked at them even from a distance. "He did this," she said. "Pike, he's warning you." Rhett stood behind her, face unreadable in the flickering light. "No," he said. "He ain't warning me. He's daring me." They watched in silence for a long moment. The place he'd built with his own hands, the porch with the creaky swing, the workshop out back, the single bed and pot-bellied stove that had held a quiet life for years, was nothing but glowing bones now. Gone. Lena May looked up at him, her voice hoarse. "What are we gonna do?" Rhett's eyes were fixed on the flames, his jaw clenched so tight it looked carved from stone. Then he knelt beside her, placed one steady hand on her shoulder. "Next time he comes for something," he said, his voice low and cold, "I'll be ready." She searched his face for hesitation and found none. Whatever fire had started in the cabin had spread to him now something fierce and final smoldering in his chest. Not just rage, resolve. And as the flames turned Rhett Maddox's past to ash, Lena May understood something new. She wasn't the only one Pike had underestimated. Not anymore. The morning after the fire smelled like wet ash and scorched memories. Rhett and Lena May had returned just after dawn, picking their way through the charred wreckage with cautious steps, the smoke still curling up from the blackened earth like something alive. The barn was nothing but collapsed beams and twisted iron. What the fire hadn't taken, the heat had warped beyond use. Rhett barely looked at it, and this focus was already on the ground behind it, where the back slope met the tree line. Lena May wandered through the rubble in silence, the hem of her dress blackened from the soot. It was strange, seeing the bones of someone's life like this, nails sticking out like ribs, tools melted into lumps, a tin cup crushed under a beam. She paused near what was left of the chicken coop and leaned against a scorched fence post to catch her breath. That's when her foot hit something solid. Not just solid metallic, buried, just beneath the dirt. She crouched down and cleared the ash with her hands. The soil was loose, disturbed recently. It didn't take long to uncover it fully. A small iron chest, dented but intact, with a rusted lock that looked like it hadn't seen daylight in years. "Rhett," she called out, brushing soot from her forehead. He appeared beside her a moment later, silent as ever, and stared down at the box. His expression didn't shift, but she saw it in his eyes, the recognition. And the hesitation. "I didn't think it would survive," he muttered. "What is it?" He knelt beside her and pulled a folded knife from his belt. It only took a few seconds before the lock snapped free with a sharp, dry pop. The lid creaked open. Inside, neatly stacked and bound in waxed paper, were letters, folded maps, old telegrams, and thick manila envelopes tied in twine. The edges were yellowed, the handwriting fading in some places. But the names were clear. The signatures, the dates. Lena May's eyes scanned the top document. It was a land deed, except the owner's name had clearly been changed. A second name, sloppily crossed out. Beneath that, in ink that didn't match, was Harlan Pike. She reached for another page. It was a foreclosure notice for a family she remembered, an old couple who'd vanished from town 2 winters back without a word. "These are real," she said, breath-catching. "He forged these, took land that wasn't his." Rhett nodded once, slow and grim. "He's been doing it for years, bribed surveyors, pressured sick old folks, took deeds off the books and put 'em back in his own name, and when someone pushed back, they disappeared." Lena May held one of the letters closer to the light. "Why didn't you show these to the sheriff?" "I tried, but paper don't mean much without a voice behind it, and no one in this town was willing to speak." She looked up at him. "But now you've got one." Their eyes met, the smoke between them curling like some kind of silent vow. He closed the chest and stood. If we bring this to the council, Pike'll come after you. I know, she said, but I'm done being scared. The wind picked up, scattering ash across the field like snow. Lena May didn't flinch. She had seen fire, she had nearly been sold, and now she had proof in her hands that Harlan Pike's empire was built on theft and silence. And she was ready to burn that empire down. The town hall of Red Hollow had never seen so many boots under one roof. The benches were packed tight, the walls lined with men and women who'd come not for ceremony or sermon, but for something much rarer: truth. It wasn't a formal courtroom, but Sheriff Dunn had dragged in the judge's old podium from storage and dusted off the rusted bell above the entrance. A hearing, he called it. Not a trial, not yet, but it would do for now. Harlan Pike stood near the back, arms folded, jaw clenched like iron. He wore his finest vest and carried the smirk of a man who'd escaped more than one reckoning. His eyes flicked across the crowd with cool disdain, daring anyone to speak out. Most didn't meet his gaze, but Rhett Maddox did. Rhett stood at the front of the room, beside Lena May and a battered trunk, the same one pulled from the ashes of his ranch. The smell of smoke still clung to it. Sheriff Dunn cleared his throat and addressed the room, his voice steady but cautious. We're here today to hear testimony regarding land claims, fraud, and accusations of unlawful coercion, he said, glancing at Pike like a man balancing on a knife's edge. Miss Lena May Calderon will speak first. Lena May rose slowly, her hands visibly trembling but her back straight. The room, noisy just seconds before, went silent. She stepped forward and laid the first forged deed on the podium. Then the letter. Then a map, corners curled and names scratched out. My father owed Harlan Pike money, she began, her voice soft but gaining strength with every word. When he couldn't pay, Pike took me instead, called it a trade. Everyone knew it wasn't right, but no one stopped him. A rustle moved through the crowd like wind through tall grass. Rhett stepped up beside her and opened the chest, pulling out document after document, deeds, letters, lists, some decades old. This is just the top layer, he said, laying the papers out one by one. Falsified signatures, stolen parcels, paid-off surveyors. You've all seen families vanish from this town. Now you know why. It took only moments for the whispers to begin. Then a voice spoke: Samuel Hart, the old carpenter whose land had mysteriously changed hands after his wife's passing. He made me sign papers I couldn't read, Hart said. Told me it was just to restructure the loan. Then another, Widow Ellison, trembling as she stood. Said if I didn't leave, my son would get hurt, so I packed and went, never said a word until now. The floodgates cracked, and voices rose one by one. Stories of threats, lies, forged documents. Years of silence unraveling in a single hour. Pike didn't flinch until Sheriff Dunn stepped forward, hand hovering near his gun. Harlan Pike, Dunn said, voice louder now, firmer. You're under investigation for fraud, intimidation, and unlawful acquisition of property. I'm placing you under. The word never finished. In one smooth motion, Pike drew a pistol from beneath his coat and pointed it directly at Lena May. The room screamed into chaos. Chairs clattered, boots scrambled. Rhett lunged forward. I should have taken you when I had the chance, Pike growled, hand steady, eyes wild. You think you've won? You think this ends with some damn papers? Lena May stood frozen, wide-eyed, staring down the barrel. But she didn't scream. She didn't run. Because she wasn't afraid of him anymore. And she knew Rhett Maddox hadn't come to this town without being ready to finish what he started. The gunshot cracked through the air like a thunderclap, silencing the room in an instant. Rhett didn't think. He didn't calculate or hesitate or wonder if it was worth it. He just moved. His body lunged between Lena May and the muzzle of Harlan Pike's revolver, and the searing pain that tore through his side came a split second after the flash. Lena May screamed his name as he dropped to the floor. Blood bloomed across Rhett's coat, hot and fast, and he crumpled with a grunt, teeth clenched, knees buckling beneath him. His shotgun clattered uselessly across the floorboards. For a heartbeat, everything froze, every breath in the room held hostage by the smell of smoke, gunpowder, and the sharp, metallic scent of blood. And then Sheriff Dunn's pistol barked once, twice. The first bullet struck Harlan Pike in the chest. The second sent him spinning backwards, arms flailing, face twisted in disbelief as he stumbled through the open doors of the town hall and crashed to the dirt outside. He didn't rise. Chows erupted. Men and women who had moments before been trembling with fear now surged forward with the force of breaking water. Voices shouted, boots pounded, chairs overturned, but none of it touched Lena May. She had fallen to her knees beside Rhett, her hands shaking as they pressed against the blood soaking through his shirt. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice cracking, her eyes wide and wild. "You hear me, Rhett? Don't you dare leave now." He grimaced, coughing once, but his eyes found hers, unfocused and pain-drunk. "Ain't planning on it." She pulled his head into her lap, brushing the hair from his forehead with trembling fingers. Around them, people were shouting for a doctor, running for bandages, calling for water. But all she could hear was the rasp of Rhett's breath, labored and shallow. "You were right," she said, tears spilling down her cheeks as she bent closer. "You said I should get to choose." He tried to speak but couldn't. His lips twitched, and his hand found hers. "I choose you," she whispered fiercely. "Not because I have to, not because I owe you, because I want to." Something flickered in his eyes then. Not the pain, not the exhaustion, but something deeper. Something that looked a lot like peace. The townsfolk gathered in a wide circle around them. Cora knelt beside them with a clean cloth. Sheriff Dunn stood nearby, his face pale and stricken, gun still smoking in his hand. A few feet away, Harlan Pike lay face down in the dirt, his blood soaking into the dust of Red Hollow. His empire of silence and threats had ended not with a trial, not with applause, but with a single gunshot and a girl who refused to be sold. And beside her, the man who stepped into the fire for her was still breathing, still alive. And for the first time in a long, long time, there was something more than just survival in that breath. There was a future. The seasons changed slowly in Red Hollow, but when they did, it felt like the land itself was breathing different air. Winter rolled out like an old dog stretching in the sun, and spring crept in quiet, golden, full of green shoots pushing stubbornly through the ash. The fire that had scarred the land was long gone, but its memory lingered in blackened fence posts and the smell of fresh timber replacing what had been lost. Rhett Maddox walked with a limp now, the bullet wound healing slower than he would have liked. But he walked up the ridge, down into town, to the little schoolhouse where he sometimes waited under the eaves, arms crossed, while the girls inside laughed at something Lena May read aloud. He always waited for her to finish before they walked home together. Red Hollow had changed, too. Sheriff Dunn swore in a new Judge Young, stern and unswayed by bribes. The town council, no longer stuffed with Harlan Pike's drinking partners, put money toward rebuilding the school and repairing the chapel roof. And when it came time to choose a new mayor, they elected old Tobias Vance, a carpenter with more calluses than teeth, but a heart big enough to carry every voice in town. And Lena May? She began teaching. The girl who had barely known her letters when her mother died now sat beneath the chalk-dusted light of the rebuilt schoolroom, guiding other girls through the shapes of words. Some came barefoot, others in hand-me-downs. All came curious. She taught them how to write their names, how to sign contracts, how to read warnings in newspapers and truth in letters. She taught them that a girl's silence wasn't something owed to any man. They listened because she didn't speak like someone who'd read books all her life. She spoke like someone who'd earned every word she knew. Up on the ridge, a new cabin rose sturdy, square, and built by Rhett's own two hands, with help from half the town. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm. Inside was a table big enough for company, a fire that never went out, and a window that looked down over the valley where smoke once danced. On the porch hung flower boxes, wild with color lilies, sage, and something called firewheel that Lena May insisted reminded her of Rhett's temper. She wore his coat now, the old one from the night he stepped in front of a bullet for her. It hung loose on her frame, the sleeves rolled up, the hem frayed, but she wore it like armor. She never called herself a wife, they never held a ceremony. But the way she stood beside him at dusk, brushing dirt from his shoulders, or the way he always built a second cup of coffee before she even stirred there, was no doubt about what they were to each other. When they walked through town now, people didn't look away. They nodded. Sometimes they even smiled. Rhett Maddox, once called the Devil of Dry Creek Ridge, was no longer a story mothers used to scare their children. He was the man who saved a girl from a rope. The man who helped expose a lie so big it nearly swallowed a town whole. But more than that, he was just a man who rebuilt his home, a man who listened instead of talked, a man who let a girl choose and was chosen back. The wind rolled gentle over the ridge that spring, carrying wildflowers and the scent of sawdust and sun-warmed earth. And if you listened close enough, you could almost hear the sound of redemption settling in. Not loud, but steady.